thanks for joining me, Mindy Mandell here. So today we're going to talk about the dialogue Meno. Now last week I wrapped up the Theaetetus, and there we talked about the difference between right opinion and knowledge. I think the Meno is a good one to follow the Theaetetus because Socrates is going to continue that theme. Only today he's going to add something to it, and namely he's going to add something called the Theory of Recollection. Okay, let's get into it. Okay, so the dialogue opens with our title character, Meno, asking Socrates whether or not virtue is something that can be taught. And by the way, all of our translations today are by Casey Guthrie. Now, Socrates, in his classic style, wants to slow him down and says, well, far from knowing whether it can be taught, I have no idea what virtue itself is. So he wants to back up and define what virtue is. Well, we saw this topic quite a bit in the early dialogues, and as with the interlocutors in the early dialogues, we see that Meno has the same sort of difficulty. He can give some examples of virtue, but he cannot define what all the virtues in all situations have in common. He says, no, I cannot yet grasp it as you want, a single virtue covering them all. Well, in the course of this discussion, we learned that Meno is not from Athens, he's visiting from Thessaly, and he's going to be leaving before the annual initiation ceremony for what is called the Eleusinian Mysteries. And Socrates just mentions this in passing, actually talking about something else. And he says, I believe you would agree with me on this other topic if you had not, as you told me yesterday, to leave before the mysteries, but could stay and be initiated. Okay, now why is this important? Well, I think that Plato threw this in because a little bit later in the dialogue, Socrates is going to tie a mythological story related to the initiation ceremony here into his explanation of the theory of recollection. And of course it makes sense that Meno is not initiated. We're going to find that he does not have the memory of the soul's knowledge that those of us who are students of Plato are seeking. All right, so what is this theory of recollection? Well, I'm going to jump to that. So Plato opens this leg of the dialogue at 80a. Meno presents Socrates with a challenge. He says, how will you look for something when you don't know in the least what it is? How on earth are you going to set up something you don't know as the object of your search? To put it another way, even if you come right up against it, how will you know that what you have found is the thing you didn't know? Right, so it's a clever objection here. Socrates calls this a trick argument. He says, do you realize that what you are bringing up is the trick argument that a man cannot try to discover either what he knows or what he does not know? He would not seek what he knows, for since he knows it, there's no need of the inquiry, nor what he does not know, for in that case he does not even know what he is looking for. Well, Socrates replies to this challenge by referring to what he refers to as men and women who understand the truths of religion. Now, here are some of the things they say. They say that the soul is immortal. They also say that we reincarnate. And then he brings up the goddess Persephone. All right, so who is Persephone? And what is her importance to this discussion? Well, there's a Greek myth here. It's quite long and complicated. In fact, it's actually a number of different stories. You could break it up into a number of stories. So what I'm going to give you is just a bare bones version of it as it's relevant to this dialogue Meno. So according to mythology, Zeus and the goddess Demeter had a daughter named Persephone. Now Demeter is the goddess of the harvest, and this is going to prove important later in the story. Her daughter Persephone is described as being sweet and innocent, and she's a virgin. So she was the apple of her mother's eye. And then one day, Zeus's brother Hades got a look at Persephone, and it was love at first sight. He fell in love and he asked Zeus if he could have her. And Zeus was fine with this. So Hades kidnapped Persephone and he took her to the afterworld. Demeter was heartbroken that her daughter was gone, and she searches high and low for her daughter. And this part of the story is quite long and winding. It's a story of its own. But eventually she learns that it was Hades who took Persephone. She demands that Zeus have Persephone returned. He told her, sorry, it's too late. And now this is where Demeter's domain over the harvest comes in. She threatened to prevent any food from growing until her daughter was returned, which would mean that humans, whom Zeus loved, would all die. Now, true to her word, famine fell over the earth. Zeus saw the suffering and finally he relented. He told Hades that Persephone had to be returned. Well, now there is a rule in the afterworld that nobody bothered to tell Persephone. It seems that if she eats anything while in the afterworld, she cannot return to the world of the living. Well, Hades, of course, knew this rule, so he offered her some pomegranates. And when she saw the fruit, she suddenly realized that, you know what, she hadn't eaten a thing in months since she arrived. So she felt very hungry and she ate the fruit. And now Zeus was in a pickle. He had to appease Demeter, but there are divine laws that even Zeus must obey. And so they made a deal. Persephone would split her time between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Now, some versions of the story have her splitting her time equally between the two, but others have her on Earth for 8 months and then with Hades in the afterworld for 4 months. And this version of the story would explain why there's no harvest in the winter months while Persephone is away from her mother, because Demeter is sad, right? And she withdraws the harvest until her daughter returns in the spring. All right, so what does any of this have to do with the Eleusinian mysteries? Well, the exact events of the annual initiation ceremony are not known, but we do know that the ceremony lasted for 10 days. And we also know that whatever exactly the ceremony was, it was based on the story of Persephone. Now, the more popular interpretation was that initiation brought the promise of a smooth transition between lifetimes. But there's also a more esoteric reading, and that was that Persephone represents the reincarnating soul. She passes from the world of the living to the world of the dead, and then back again, much like our reincarnating souls. Only she retains her memories of the world she had left. And what this means is that she knows what it is we must learn in order to grow wise. Well, Plato writes, they say that the soul of man is immortal. At one time it comes to an end, that which is called death, and at another is born again, but is never fully exterminated. On these grounds, a man must live all his days as righteously as possible. And then he quotes a few lines from Pindar. He says, those from whom Persephone receives requital for ancient doom, in the 9th year she restores again their soul to the sun above. Now, I'm not sure why 9. I've tried to find this, but I cannot. So if anyone out there does know the significance of the number 9, I would really love for you to drop a note in the comment box. But anyway, what we're seeing here is that we have to pay a fine, if you will, for our ignorance. If we want to grow wise, we have to give something up. And what we give up is our ignorance. That's the only way to become wise. And this passing, this memory of what we knew when we were out of our body, this is a kind of remembering, really. And so this is what Plato calls, or what academia now calls, the theory of recollection. This is the idea behind it. The soul, since it is immortal and has been born many times and has seen all things both here and in the other world, has learned everything that is. If we could retain our memories, then we, like Persephone, would have perfect memory of the other world or what is beyond our body. Right? So the basic gist of the theory is that the kind of learning that we're pursuing in philosophy is really the soul remembering its own inner wisdom. Now, this whole line of thinking, remember, was in response to Meno's argument that we cannot learn anything because we won't recognize what we don't know when we find it. And Socrates is saying, yes, we will, because we're not blank slates. Learning is recollection. This is really what was missing in last week's discussion in the Theaetetus. Because in the Theaetetus, remember, Socrates used the analogy of the soul being like an aviary, where we catch birds and put them inside, and each bird represents a piece of knowledge. That is a blank slate argument, and it ultimately did not work. So Socrates is giving us here what was missing in the dialogue Theaetetus. And to Meno, he says this: we ought not then to be led astray by the contentious argument you quoted. It would make us lazy, and is music in the ears of weaklings. Well, the conversation continues from here, and it's brought to the conclusion that when a forgotten truth is first awakened, it has a dreamlike quality to it. Initially, it's more of a true opinion than a solid piece of knowledge. So a man who does not know has in himself true opinions on a subject without having knowledge. But it can solidify into knowledge. This knowledge will not come from teaching, but from questioning. He will recover it for himself. And Meno agrees, yes. And this is really why I think Socrates preferred the questioning method. If he felt that we were blank slates and he had to put knowledge into us, he would lecture people. But since he sees that we bring out our own inner knowledge, our own inner wisdom, he preferred the questioning method. And the spontaneous recovery of knowledge that is within him is recollection, isn't it? And Meno agrees, yes, it is. So this question of the difference between right opinion and knowledge is one that we saw last week in Theaetetus. It's going to come up again in this dialogue, but before they continue this leg of the discussion, Meno is going to take us on a little tangent. He wants to go back to his earlier question. He says, I would rather consider the question as I put it at the beginning and hear your views on it. That is, are we to pursue virtue as something that can be taught, or do men have it as a gift of nature, or how? So notice here that Meno again wants to jump over the question of what virtue is, and he wants to instead consider whether virtue can be taught. Now this is actually a step back in the application of dialectic. I'm going to do a video on dialectic in a few weeks when we're looking at the dialogue Phaedrus, but just briefly I'll say a few words about dialectic. When you're doing a formal dialectical exploration, you're asking a basic question: if something exists, then what follows? For example, if soul exists, what follows? If virtue exists, what follows? If beauty exists, what follows? And then you want to pursue it in two directions. First, what is that thing in itself? And then how does it function? Now, this is a very difficult exploration, especially when you're just starting out. We come back to these dialectical explorations over and over again. It's not like you do it one time and you're done, right? You're going to be deepening your insights over the years, and so you keep returning and you see new things. So it's very hard, though, early on when you haven't yet developed the vocabulary or the concepts. You don't really have a grasp of metaphysics yet. So it's very hard. And so there's a tendency to want to skip over the definition part and just accept it as a given. Like, let's just accept that virtue exists. And then we can follow this other pattern. This one, I just put it in brief form here. I'll explain it in a moment. If X is Y, what follows? In other words, if virtue is teachable, what follows? Or just to give another example, if the soul is immortal, what follows?
So Socrates sees that Meno is not able, or maybe just not willing, to tackle the more primary question of what virtue is. And so he sees, all right, he needs to change gears. And so he's going to go for this structure instead and say, okay, let's accept that virtue exists. And he asks, what attribute of the soul must virtue be if it is to be teachable or otherwise? In other words, if virtue is teachable, what follows? So he's using that structure. All right, so they have a long discussion. I'm going to summarize it for you. These are some of the conclusions that they reached. And as you can see on the screen, this is a summary of Stephanus numbers 87c through 89a. So they reached 10 conclusions. First, if virtue is teachable, then it must be some kind of knowledge. And remember, all of these conclusions are based on the assumption if virtue is teachable. So it must be some kind of knowledge, and virtue is some sort of good, and therefore it gives us some advantage. Now, those things which we call advantageous and good are things such as health, wealth, strength, good looks, and so on. But we know that these things can be harmful too. And so they agree that right use is what determines if they're harmful or advantageous. Now, there are qualities of the soul that can also be seen as good. Courage, temperance, also things like quick memory and quick mind and that sort of thing. These too can be harmful if they're applied ignorantly. Therefore, all that we undertake or suffer, and they mean active or passive, what happens to us and what we do, it leads to happiness if it's guided by wisdom. And therefore, if virtue is good and advantageous, then it must be some sort of wisdom. And so they conclude that virtue then, if it is teachable, it is not by nature, but is cultivated through wisdom. And so Socrates concludes of all this that if virtue is teachable, then good men cannot be good by nature. Well, Meno is pleased with this conclusion, but Socrates is not. He says, I don't withdraw from the position that if it is knowledge, it must be teachable. But as for its being knowledge, see whether you think my doubts on this point are well-founded. If anything, not virtue only, is a possible subject of instruction, must there not be teachers and students of it? Well, this is now going to lead them to a discussion of Sophists who were the teachers of Socrates' day. And they're also joined at this point by a man named Anytus. Now we're going to find that Anytus is quite hostile towards the Sophists. His entrance marks a shift in the dialogue. He's quite critical of Socrates and also what he interprets, at least, as Socrates' lack of respect for world leaders. Now, Anytus, also, it might be helpful to point out, is one of the 3 men who had brought charges against Socrates. He did not like Socrates, and his dislike is clear in this dialogue. Well, you might recall that this whole discussion about whether virtue is teachable was actually a tangent from our discussion of the theory of recollection. Now, before Meno changed the subject, Socrates was saying that our recollections are initially hazy, like dreams, and he characterized right opinion as being of a dream-like quality, but it can later solidify into knowledge. And so now they're going to get back into this topic. Now, as we've seen with tangents in other dialogues, this one as well is really no tangent at all. It's a tangent for Socrates and Meno, but for Plato, it's not. It's a device that he's using because he wants to bring what was discussed in that tangent into the later part of the discussion. And again, Socrates is going to bring that into this current discussion. So here's what he says about true opinions. Socrates says that true opinions are a fine thing, and they do all sorts of good, so long as they stay in their place. But they will not stay long. They run away from a man's mind, so they're not worth much until you tether them by working out the reason. And that process, my dear Meno, is recollection, as we agreed earlier. In other words, right opinion tells us what is true, but it's only through our remembrance that we gain the why. Socrates says, it is not, I am sure, a mere guess to say that right opinion and knowledge are different. There are few things that I should claim to know, but that at least is among them, whatever else is. So a rare time when Socrates says that he knows something. All right, well, in Socrates' discussion with Anytus, Anytus reluctantly comes to agree that public leaders more likely have right opinion than knowledge. They agree that knowledge is not the guide in public life. It is not then by the possession of any wisdom that such men as Themistocles and the others whom Anytus mentioned just now became leaders in their cities. This fact that they do not owe their eminence to knowledge will explain why they are unable to make others like themselves. And so that leaves them with this other alternative, that it is well in conjecture what statesmen employ in upholding their country's welfare. Their position in relation to knowledge is no different from that of prophets and tellers of oracles, who under divine inspiration utter many truths, but have no knowledge of what they are saying. All right, so political leaders are not acting from knowledge and they cannot be teachers. But does this mean that nobody can be a teacher? Well, at the very end of the dialogue, Socrates slips in this statement about the teacher. He says, should there be such a man, he would be among the living practically what Homer said Tiresias was among the dead, when he described him as the only one in the underworld who kept his wits. Where virtue is concerned, such a man would be just like that, a solid reality among shadows. This statement seems to go right over Meno's head, and they just kind of leave it with this idea that nobody can be a teacher. Meno just didn't get it. However, it's not going to go over ours. I especially want to focus on this phrase, a solid reality among shadows. This strikes me as a reference to the famous allegory of the cave in Book 7 of the Republic. Now, I think many of you are at least familiar with the story. If you have not read the Republic, maybe you've at least heard the story. Certainly in our cultures, there are many references to it. This is the story that compares us to people chained in a cave from childhood, chained in such a way that we're staring at a wall and there are shadows on the wall, and we mistake the shadows for reality because that's all we know. And then in the allegory, somebody is able to leave their chains and look around the cave, and eventually they go up a steep incline to the upper world, and they leave the cave and they see the realities in the upper world. And those realities would be what we call the forms or the ideas, eidos in Greek. And these are the things that we need to remember. And so if you have that remembrance and you go back down into the cave, you would be like a solid reality among the shadows. And so this move from right opinion to knowledge requires recalling the realities in the upper world. And this is why Socrates ends the dialogue by telling Meno, we shall not understand the truth of the matter until, before asking how men get virtue, we try to discover what virtue is in and by itself. To know what virtue is means to know virtue as it is in what the cave allegory would call the upper world. So what we see here is that to move from right opinion to knowledge requires more than just reading passively. It means you must be more active. Now, I always appreciate anyone watching these videos. They can certainly bring you some degree of understanding or right opinion of Plato's ideas. And I think that's always beneficial to people. So if that's all you want out of Plato, then that's fine. But for those of you who do want to go beyond that passive level to truly knowing yourself, you do have to do more. These videos are not enough. You have to have the insights yourself. You need to transform internally in order to go from right opinion to knowing. Now I'm going to do something that is highly out of character for me. I'll probably never do this again. But I'm going to toot my own horn for a moment because I did write a book that came out earlier this year. And by the way, there's more information about the book in the description box. And just for your information, my daughter did the artwork on the cover. All right, so this book describes the need for the Platonic path and its goal of knowing thyself and developing the virtues. It takes the reader through all the stages that you would need to go through, going out of the cave and going back down. What do you actually have to do? What do those stages represent in your actual daily life and practice? So it's about how to use the writings in the Platonic canon to go beyond right opinion and to grasp true knowledge for yourself. Just briefly, here are some excerpts from the book. This is coming from the second chapter. In the first chapter, I gave just some biographical information about Plato and Socrates, who their influences were. And also, in the book, I include some of the later Platonists, like Proclus and Plotinus, and so I introduced them as well in chapter 1. Then in chapter 2, I set up our journey here, and this chapter is called A Different Approach, because we do take a very different approach from the biblical religions. And so I'll read just a little bit. Maybe those of you on your phone cannot read this, it's too small, so I will read it for you. We must care more about knowing truth than about achieving any social measure of success, such as wealth or popularity. And that, of course, is referring to those people who want to go from right opinion to knowledge. In practice, this involves seeing through whatever ignorance we currently hold about ourselves and humanity's place in the whole. As we deepen our studies and meditations on truth, we find ourselves questioning and ultimately dropping images that are incompatible with our insights. And while this is often empowering and exciting, it can also at times be a painful process. To some degree, this is part of the natural process of growing up. We naturally outgrow childish states of mind as we get older. As we go into our teenage years, for example, we gain more independence and maturity, and so we outgrow our adolescent images. In adulthood, most of us outgrow the drama from high school. At some point, though, our growth seems to come to a halt. We might take on a psychological or spiritual practice that allows us to evolve within a certain mindset that we've already embraced and solidified for ourselves. But rarely do we challenge our most fundamental assumptions about ourselves or about the nature of reality. Platonists, however, recognize a further level of growth. Beyond what we might call emotional maturity or psychological maturity is an even higher goal, spiritual maturity. Within the context of this deeper spiritual growth, we do not place a high value on merely changing our outward behavior, such as stopping ourselves from gossiping or competing with our friends. These types of behavioral changes are difficult when the insights involved are only conceptual. We understand, for example, that we should not begrudge other people's successes, but the heart and the mind are often in conflict. The aim of those who follow the Platonic path is to change inwardly. When this inward change occurs, behavioral changes follow as a natural expression of the person we are evolving into. In the dialogue Republic, Plato shows that when our soul is guided by wisdom, our desires and attitudes naturally fall in line with what is good and healthy for the soul. Spiritual maturity develops by nurturing an understanding of the nature of reality and our place in the whole. These insights will eventually compel us to question our sense of individuality and what it means to be a human being. All of these changes necessarily precipitate a shift in how we relate to other people and what we deem most important in our lives. Looking back to who I was at the start of my own spiritual journey, I see great changes. For example, I've increasingly lost interest in outward signs of success such as job status and wealth, and I feel a deeper connection to the people around me and to nature. These are not changes that I forced on myself or have embraced because they are ideals I've read about. They are natural outgrowths of contemplating metaphysics and letting its implications reverberate through all areas of my life. There are no 10 Commandments or Eightfold Path in Plato's system. because the focus in our practice is on understanding what it means to be wise, developing the state of mind of one who naturally desires what is beneficial for the soul. Socrates was a good man, but not because he denied himself things he wanted. His wisdom and piety did not lie in his ability to repress selfish or greedy desires. Instead, his thoughts and desires naturally fell in line with wisdom, and that is the mark of a wise person and the goal of this practice. This is in no way meant to imply that we never feel growing pains. Of course we do. It can be quite painful to let go of the person we had thought ourselves to be. Conceptual insights are not sufficient for the depth of growth that we are seeking. We will find as the book proceeds that false beliefs still affect us even after we see through them conceptually. It is in that gap between the conceptual insight and the actual dropping of the belief that we feel and need to exercise fortitude. But our fortitude is aimed at challenging our belief structure rather than at strengthening our willpower to resist temptation. The first step on this journey is to make a commitment to ourselves to proceed with fortitude, sincerity, and integrity. The exploration of reality is not an objective reasoning process that separates us from our own states of mind. Our beliefs and assumptions about ourselves are the very lens through which we reason. Therefore, our study of metaphysics is very much a study of ourselves. And so what we're seeing here, what I wanted to point out with this, is that when you want to go from right opinion to knowledge, you have to do more than just have an objective look at a bunch of theories in a book. You have to turn it inward. You have to see what it does to you and what it means to you.
I do think that this discussion around the Meno is a very important one. This move from right opinion to knowledge is one that often gets overlooked or ignored at the university level. But it's actually, I would argue, what Platonism is all about. I would even go the next step and say that this is our human destiny. So if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them below or drop me an email. Also, if you enjoyed what you saw today, I would really appreciate a thumbs up. Please think about subscribing also if you're not already subscribed. I do put out a new video each week. We're going to see this virtuous state of mind front and center in the next dialogue that I'm going to talk about, which is the symposium. So I do hope you will join me next week. Thank you.